Hi, welcome back for another Tool Time Tuesday. I'm Melissa Muir. Last week, I introduced you to the bezel making kit from Jim Brandvik. It is a way for you to make extremely thick bezels, but with serrations or a castellated edge using his indexing tool, the top jaws, and the bez jaws. Today, we are going to finish up that project that we began, so let's jump right in now. So last week I introduced you to the different holding tools that he has for creating these thick walled bezels. This happens to be 18 gauge. If you recall, we used a number 3 saw blade, and we also used the indexing tools to make certain that these serrations were even across. We began by cutting the top edge, flipping it over, and then creating that decorative marking here along the side. So now that we have this, what we need to do is get this to fit our stone. Now remember, last week we cut our little piece of tape so that it would fit around that perimeter of our stone. So this needs to be the very minimum length of my bezel. Now, I do not want to use this as the marking for my bezel. So if I were to actually come in here and cut right there, which shows me kind of the indicator that that's exactly how big of a bezel I need. However, if I cut this right now, I'm going to be too short. And why is that? Because my bezel is 18 gauge. My tape is not 18 gauge. So that is going to give me the wrong measurement for my particular stone. And I need to do something a little different. So what I'm going to do is use this as a guide to make certain that I at least have enough. Now, if you really wanted to, you could measure around this perimeter. You could take this, measure it, and then do your whole pie, square, whatever. I'm so bad at doing anything mathematical and meticulous like that. So I'm actually going to use the stone as my guide rather than this tape. But it shows you a couple of different options that you can use. So what I'm going to do is use the stone as my guide, like I said. And what I'm going to need is also a pair of pliers. In this case, I have a pair of Wubbers. They are the parallel jaw pliers, and I like these because when I come in and close down on an object, it's going to close down evenly all the way from the top of my piece to the bottom of my piece. Now when I do this around my stone, I want my join to be on one of these larger ends, never on a point, and I usually try to avoid the smaller ends of my piece. Now the reason for that is because I'm going to be bending this over. Now it's not going to be as big of a deal because we have these serrations on this particular bezel. But when I have a solid bezel that I'm trying to bring around, that solder seam is going to be difficult to push over. So I always just have that good practice of always trying to put my join on a larger run of my stone. So I'm going to use my round nose pliers, and I'm going to just kind of pick an arbitrary spot that's kind of a little bit further away from this end. And I'm going to begin to curl this around. Then I'm going to put it here on my stone, and you can see that I've actually made this a little bit too small. So too small of a curve. Maybe I just come back in with this larger end and can create a little bit bigger. And that's a much better fit for my stone. So now that I've got that, and here's another thing too, I did anneal this. You want your metal to be nice and soft, and so it's a little bit more malleable so that you can get this around your stone. So if you're finding that it's difficult to move around, take a minute and go anneal it, and then come back and do this step. So now that I have a good curve here, I'm just going to use my fingers as much as possible because my fingers don't leave tool marks, and I'm going to push this around as much as I can. So hopefully now you can see I have a very good overlap spot right here, and you can also see that almost fits that joint, but not quite. So I don't know that I actually want to go right there at this little serration that happens, because if I do actually run the risk of being slightly small. However, if you guys can see, there is a little bit of a pocket, an air pocket that's created because of the way this wraps around. Now what that's going to do for me is that actually allows me to have some room that I could push this back. So quite honestly, I could cut quite safely right there at that serration, and then as I bring this in, they should meet up beautifully. Now that happened to be lucky. That doesn't always happen. So sometimes I actually have to cut either at the next serration or even right in the middle of one of my serrated jaws or serrated sections. And it's just going to have to play out however you have this. However, the nice thing is that if it does end up in one of the middle, then I have a little section that's just ever so slightly bigger as far as the spacing goes, and sometimes that's a little easy to fudge. But another thing that you can do too is you can sometimes stretch this, since we have so much material. You can put this onto a mandrel and then use a steel hammer and stretch it out just a little bit. Doesn't always happen, but it is a possibility. And that's totally another video. So we're not going to talk about that. In this case, I feel pretty confident that I can cut right here at this serrated joint. So that is what I'm going to do. And if you feel like you need to, you can always use a marker and just mark where it's going to be. And that way you know for certain which one to cut. So I just cut that there on that side. You can use your cutters, you can use your shears, whatever you feel comfortable cutting with, go ahead and make that little cut. And at this point, I have a little bit of an edge there that's not quite meeting up, so I may need to file this down just a little bit. But before we do that, let's put this back on our stone and make certain that we are going to join around and we have a fantastic fit. Now, one thing that I am noticing here is this end right here has a little bit of a slant to that. So I'm going to file that ever so slightly with my file and just clean that up before I solder this. Once I'm happy with the fit of this, I am going to then solder this seam closed, and then we are going to solder this onto our back plate. But first you want to solder that seam so that then you can fit your stone and make sure that everything looks good, it is nice and tight, and then you can move forward from there. To solder this, I'm using my Solderite pad. I've now got my piece, I've completely closed it. I'm happy with how my join looks on the bottom, on the sides, on the inside, however you want to do this. And what I'm going to do here is place this so that it's on my board, my seam is up, and you can do this any number of ways. You can do pick soldering, you can place your solder right on your piece, whichever method works best for you. First thing I'm going to do is coat that seam in a little bit of flux. I want to make sure that that seam looks really good as far as the flux goes. That's going to help my solder to flow. You can then take your piece of solder and place it onto this, or you can do the pick soldering method, like I said, however works best for you. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and set that piece of solder right there on the seam. I'm going to get my torch going, and I want to very gently, I'm going to sweep over the top of this just to kind of get things heated up. So I know it's a little harder to see this part of the video. Let's see if I can scoot this forward and you guys can see a little bit more of that flame. Once I've got the top warmed up, I'm then going to sweep along the bottom, and then I kind of go along the top, along the bottom, along the top, along the bottom. And what that does is it makes certain that this piece is heated evenly. All right, so now we saw that solder flow right there, and that's what I wanted to see. We have a nice join. Quench everything really quick. And the next thing that we need to do is fit this back onto our stone, make certain that that looks good, and then we will solder it onto our back plate. In this case, I've textured up a piece of silver. I'm going to solder this onto my silver this way. I'll probably cut this down just a little bit so I don't have to heat up such a large area. So now I have my bezel is completely soldered. I have yet to pickle it, so there are some darker areas on here where we've got a little bit of that fire scale that happens, and I'm not worried about that yet. I just want to test the fit of my piece, and this is beautiful. We just slip right on, and here's how I kind of test it. If I can pop my stone back out so it can go in either direction and it can easily pop out, but you see how snug that is? That to me is a really good fit for my stone, and I'm very, very happy with that. Another thing that I can do here is I can look and see if I have any really high spots of my bezel compared to my stone. Sometimes you have a stone that's not perfectly cut or perfectly flat, or maybe the curve along the top is a little higher on one side than the other. And so what happens is you end up having a stone that rocks, or maybe you end up with a bezel that folds over much further than it on one side than it does on the other, and certainly not desirable. So there are a number of things that you can do to get around that, and that would include like lifting your stone in one area versus another. You've seen or maybe heard of some jewelers even using things like sawdust, or there's sometimes, like when I learned to make things with like a credit card, or even like the top of a butter tin, or not a butter tub. So, so it's got a little bit of squishiness to it. In this case, when I look at this stone, what I'm doing is I'm looking around the edge of the stone to where that bezel kind of starts to meet. And I want to see if I have any really big gaps. In this case, it doesn't really look like I'm too far off or too bad, but I do notice that my stone is definitely higher here than it is over here. And so if I come in and I just raise one edge of that stone, I can kind of see if this stone would benefit from being lifted in an area versus another. In this case, not so much, but I will show you at least the process of what I do to do that when we get to the point of setting the stone. The next thing that I need to do is solder this onto my back plate. Now, when I put this through the rolling mill, you can see that there's a little bit of warpage that has happened here. Part of that needs to be relaxed. So I've not annealed this since it went through the rolling mill. I put a pattern on here that's going to be the back of my piece, and I'm going to solder my piece onto this. And when you solder a piece onto a back plate, you want to have a really nice flat fit. And so if you lift up your piece and you look through it, you want to be able to see it touch this back plate all the way around. Now I know that it's going to, because I can see that here, but I want to do two things really. I want to run this on some sandpaper like this. And so what that's going to do for me is kind of smooth everything down, because not always when you solder, sometimes they end up having a little bit of a ridge or a bump, especially right there at that solder seam, and we need to address that. The other thing I need to do is get this to lay flat. So I'll probably anneal this and then maybe place it in between a couple of bench blocks, or I might actually put it through the rolling mill again, just so that we can get this flattened down. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this down a little bit, because my pendant isn't going to be that big, so I don't need to heat this entire thing to create my pendant. So that's the other things that I'm going to do. So I'm going to go cut that down just a little bit, anneal this, and get it to lay flat, and then I'm also going to sand down my bezel. At this point, I have cut down the back plate a little bit just so that I don't have as big of a heat sink. And I've also filed everything, made sure that everything lays nicely. I've got no gaps, so I don't have to worry too much about soldering this closed. Next thing I've done is I've placed a little ring of flux around this, and I've placed some solder chips in here that I'm going to move around. Now, I would like them to touch the wall. At this point, it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot because that flux is a little wet, and as I go to heat this up, that flux will probably bubble away a lot of my solder. So don't be too concerned yet. It's going to get a little sticky, and the solder will kind of be difficult to manipulate, at least until we get that flux into the proper state. Yes, I actually have quite a bit of solder on here. You don't need quite this much, but sometimes it's better to have just a little bit more than not enough. Okay, so at this point I have my solder. It is around my ring. I'm going to, you'll watch, I'm going to kind of come in and then come back out, come back in, come back out with my torch. And what that allows me to do is dry that flux without necessarily bubbling things up too much. So get my torch going. Again, like I said, I'm going to come in, warm it up a little bit, and then back out, in and out, because I want to eliminate as much of that solder bubbling out of place as possible. All right, we actually look pretty good here, so not too much of it moved out of place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate my torch around the back plate of my piece, and then I'll come in to the middle and again go around, come into the middle and around. And what I'm really trying to do is heat up this back plate. If you have it where you can kind of lift this up, some people will build a little wire nest to go underneath their piece, and that allows them to heat from underneath. It just depends on your training, what you've been taught, and your method of how you like to do things. There's a number of ways, no right way, no wrong way. Well, I guess there are right and wrong ways, but in this case, it's just kind of a whatever you choose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate my heat right here at the back plate, but along that bezel. So I want to pull that solder out towards my torch. Now, if I'm going to cut away the outer piece, then I actually just put the solder out here on the side. All right, so I'm actually starting to see this flow, and what I'm going to do is just walk my torch around and watch that solder flow as I come across. There we go. And at this point, I have seen a beautiful solder seam all the way around my piece, and I am done. So I'm going to give this just a second to cool down just a little bit, and then we will quench it. Best studio sound ever. All right, so at this point, everything is soldered. I have a beautiful seam that I watched as I walked that heat around. I'm going to place this back into the pickle, and now we're ready to get the rest of our pendant designed and kind of go from there. I have done quite a bit of work on this pendant to kind of get things ready. So you now see this in a state of kind of early preparation here. What I've done is I've cut away the back plate. I soldered on some additional little enhancements. So in this case, some little balls. And then I have a tube setting where I will set a blue topaz CZ in there. So in the stone, I'm now ready to kind of test the fit and make sure everything is good to go. Now, while this is still a little bit warm, this is a thermoplastic, and I like to put it into this because what's going to happen is I am going to have to hammer this down. But before this gets too cold and fully set, so while it's still warm and I can move things around, I want to test the fit of my stone into this. Now you'll notice that I have cut out the back plate of my piece, and that is because I had such good fire and flash to my piece that I wanted to be able to show that. So I used the existing design on my printed pattern to help with that. And what I'm going to do is just kind of test fit this. Now, if it doesn't quite fit, or it seems to be a little tight, so maybe I have it upside down or whatever the case might be, I'm going to flip that stone around, see if it fits a little better this way, which it totally does. And what I'm looking for now is I want to see how it truly fits now that everything is soldered onto the back plate, because before all I could do is just set the stone on the tabletop to see how this fit. Now this actually fits beautifully. I do not need to raise this stone at all. Now when I have a back plate that I've cut out similar to this, I don't want to cover that all up. So you'll notice that the holes in my back plate have a twofold purpose. Makes it so that I can easily get my stone out as well as being a part of that decorative design. But let's say that I did need to raise this stone and I have this decorative element already in here. That's not something that I want to undo or get rid of or cover up. So obviously I can't use sawdust. I can't use the top of a margarine lid or anything like that. So what I will do, now this happens to just be a head pin that's sitting here on my tabletop, but a lot of times I'll take like a 20 gauge wire and I will just create basically like a little step bezel. And I just lay it into, so I'll shape it around however I need. Let me cut off the head of this so you can really see what it is that I do. So I'm just going to bring this in here and manipulate it so that it sits up against the edges of that bezel. Then I can put my stone in on top of that and see if it lifts my stone up far enough. Now in this case, it's not necessary, it's not needed, but that's one way that I do this. And then it's kind of nice because it doesn't show through the back. This one would, because my design comes all the way to the edge, but in this case that wouldn't really be that bad. However, like I said, I don't actually need that. So what I'm going to do now is put this back into this thermoplastic before it gets too hard and I'm not able to manipulate it. And we're almost there. So this thermoplastic, the thing that's kind of nice about this is it just requires hot water to get it to where it's soft, and then you can make this come in and surround your piece and it will hold it into place. Now the reason that that's important for this particular piece here is that these are really thick and it's going to take some effort to push this over, and I'm going to do this with a hammer and a punch. And so I need to have something hold this because both of my hands are going to be needed for the setting part of this stone. So what I'm going to do is set up my vise and get that ready to go again while this is setting for me. There we go. Looks like that's going to fit in there nice and tight. So what I have here is just my vise, my bench vise. This is not a very big one. And because I have used this thermoplastic on a wooden dowel, I can just take that wooden dowel and place it into this vise. Now this is still, I think we're probably set pretty close. You really want to let this set up, and the thing that's nice about it is that when you pour the hot water on it, it becomes translucent, so you can tell when it's ready to be manipulated and really malleable. And see, I can see that there's quite a bit of movement on this, whereas as it gets cold, it will set up super hard. Okay, so the next thing that I need to do is make certain I have my stone in the right orientation, and I happen to pay attention to the flash that is on this, so I know that my stone sets in this way. So I'm going to pop my stone into here, make sure that it's seated well, and again I'm going to just kind of look around my stone, make sure everything looks good. And we do look good. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to begin to set my stone. Now I'm going to go from the top to the bottom to the side to the side. And you want to work around always on opposite ends like this. So I'm going to use just a chasing punch and a chasing hammer. And very gently I'm going to bring this in and hammer down two of my little prongs, if you will, or these serrated sections. And the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over to the side and do the same, and then I come to the opposite side. It looks like I need to tighten this up a little bit so we don't have as much movement there. There we go. And now that I've done northeast, southwest, I'm going to go kind of northeast, southwest, and so on and so forth. And again, you just work those opposite sections. Okay, and by doing this, what happens is it locks your stone in beautifully. There we go. And you should be able to see these items move. And again, I just want to ensure that my stone is staying seated or remains seated while we do this. And I'm not hitting very hard, and I want to be very, very cautious so that my punch does not slip off and hit my stone. And you should be able to watch the movement as it brings these different serrated edges in. And I'm bringing this down kind of at a 45-degree angle. And it doesn't help that this continues to move, so that's just one of my little things I'm going to have to deal with. Tighten this back up a little bit more. And once you have this where it's seated pretty well, you can actually then start to move just down the stone. And you just want to watch this metal to move over the stone. And I'm hitting the outside edge here. And if you need to, because I'm able to easily get this, but because of the angle I'm at, I'm having a more difficult time getting to this side. So I'm just going to turn this around and give myself a little different vantage point. There we go. And we are now actually looking really good. So I want to look along the edge of this stone and the bezel and just kind of see where everything lays. And as long as I don't see anything sticking up, then we're good to go. Once I get this done, I'll just run my polishing edge just right around that and give it a nice bright finish, and you are done and good to go. So now you've seen how to go right from very scratch, cutting your 18 gauge bezel strip all the way to the end where we've now finished our pendant. It does take a little bit more effort to push this over because you are working with 18 gauge. So that's a little different if you've never done that before. You just basically want to find some way to hold your piece so that then you can move that bezel over. And I personally have found that the easiest way for me to do that is with a nice punch and a chasing hammer. It does take a little bit more effort. There's a little bit more to do on that, but it gives you this great look. And now we have our finished pendant, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to give me a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and mark that you would like the notifications. There's just that little bell icon next to the subscribe button. And when you do that, then you will receive notifications when I have posted new videos. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you guys next time.